Listen, what I'm about to tell you is happening right now. And it's not just about tariffs anymore. Canada just made a move that has Washington scrambling. And I mean actually scrambling. Because for the first time in decades, Canada isn't playing defense. They're restructuring the entire North American economic relationship while everyone's watching. Here's what nobody's talking about. When tariffs hit 35% back in August, most analysts thought Canada would cave. Do what they always do. Negotiate quietly, make concessions, preserve access to American markets at any cost. That's the playbook. That's how it's always worked. But here's where it gets complicated. Mark Carney became Prime Minister in March 2025, former Governor of the Bank of Canada, former Governor of the Bank of England. This isn't a career politician. This is someone who spent his entire professional life understanding exactly how financial leverage works. And what I'm seeing now suggests he's been planning this response for months. 3 weeks ago in Davos, Carney gave a speech, the kind of speech that doesn't make headlines immediately but changes everything. He stood in front of the world's economic elite and said something remarkable. He said the rules-based international order is experiencing a rupture, not a transition, and that middle powers like Canada need to stop negotiating from weakness and start building strategic autonomy. Wait, it gets worse. 2 days after that speech, Carney signed a $7 billion trade agreement with China, energy, agriculture, critical minerals, the kind of deal that diversifies Canada's export markets away from total American dependence. Reports are coming in that this wasn't just about canola seeds and electric vehicles. This was about creating alternative pathways for Canadian resources. Trump's response? Immediate. He threatened a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods if that China deal went forward, 100%. That's not a negotiating position, that's an attempt at economic coercion. And then something interesting happened. Trump revoked Carney's invitation to his Board of Peace. The symbolic gesture was clear: fall in line or face consequences. But that's not even the real story. The real story is what Canada's been doing quietly while everyone focused on the headlines. Because while Trump was threatening tariffs, Canada was implementing a systematic restructuring of its economic exposure, not retaliation, restructuring. And the difference matters. Documents reveal that Canada's been working on this for months. Supply chain diversification, energy export redirections, critical mineral processing agreements with Europe and Asia, investment attraction from non-American sources. This isn't reactive, this is strategic. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture, because Canada's response isn't designed to win a tariff war in the traditional sense. It's designed to make American tariffs hurt America as much as they hurt Canada, maybe more. And they're doing it through 10 specific actions that most people aren't even tracking yet. This is the part that kept me up last night. Each of these actions targets a sector where American workers, American companies, and American politicians feel pressure immediately. Auto manufacturing, agriculture, energy infrastructure, technology procurement. The kind of pressure that doesn't show up in trade statistics for months, but becomes politically impossible to ignore within weeks. So the question isn't whether Canada can survive tariffs. The question is what happens when a country that supplies 40% of America's crude oil, 60% of its electricity imports, and massive portions of its critical minerals for electric vehicle batteries decides it doesn't want to be treated like a subordinate anymore. Stay with me, because what I'm about to walk you through is how Canada is converting American pressure into American cost, sector by sector, decision by decision, and why this approach might actually work. All right, let me show you exactly what Canada's doing and why it matters. Action 1, automotive supply chains. Canada isn't just threatening tariffs on cars. They're introducing new inspection protocols at the border, tighter rules of origin enforcement. What does that mean in practice? It means even a modest delay at customs creates inventory chaos for American auto manufacturers. Production schedules become unstable. Assembly plants in Michigan and Ohio start running reduced shifts. And here's the thing, you don't need to stop trade to create pressure. You just need to introduce friction. The latest information shows this is already happening. Customs clearance times have increased, not dramatically, but enough that logistics managers are holding emergency meetings. Because in auto manufacturing, timing is everything. A 2-day delay in parts delivery can shut down an entire assembly line. And when that happens, workers notice, unions notice, congressional representatives from auto-dependent districts start making phone calls. But here's what nobody's talking about. Action 2. Electric vehicle minerals. Canada controls massive reserves of lithium, nickel, and cobalt, the exact minerals needed for EV battery production. Instead of blocking exports outright, which would be too aggressive, Canada's prioritizing domestic processing and long-term agreements with European and Asian partners. What we're learning is that these agreements lock in supply for years. For American EV manufacturers, this creates a problem. Not today, Not next month, but 18 months from now when they need to scale production and discover that reliable mineral supplies are already committed elsewhere. Battery costs become uncertain, project timelines slip, and investors start asking hard questions about supply chain security. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Action 3, energy redirection. Canada supplies 40% of American crude oil. Reports are coming in that Canada's been quietly accelerating liquefied natural gas projects aimed at Asian markets, new pipeline infrastructure to the West Coast, export terminal expansions. These aren't emergency measures. These are multi-year projects that were already in development, but the timeline's been accelerated. What does that mean for the United States? It means over the next 3 to 5 years, Canada becomes less dependent on American energy demand. And when you're less dependent, you have more leverage. Energy markets work on long-term contracts. Once those contracts shift to Asian buyers, they don't shift back easily. Path dependency sets in. And then this happened. Action 4, agricultural pressure. Canada announced new quotas and inspection standards on American beef, corn, and soybeans. Not a full ban, just tighter restrictions. Sources are now confirming this creates immediate inventory stress for American agricultural exporters. Grain elevators start holding excess supply. Prices drop, and farmers in Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas feel the impact before anyone in Washington does. Here's what makes this effective. Agricultural states carry outsized political weight. When farm income drops, senators take notice fast. This isn't abstract trade policy anymore. This is direct economic pressure on constituencies that matter in American politics. But that's not even the real escalation. Action 5, logistics redirection. Canada's rerouting container traffic away from American ports, favoring Canadian-controlled corridors, Prince Rupert, Vancouver, Halifax. The shift is gradual but persistent. And here's why it matters. Ports lose handling fees. Warehouses see reduced throughput. Regional transport jobs face uncertainty. In the global economy, logistics friction compounds over time. Officials are now saying this could permanently alter North American trade routes, because once shipping companies establish new patterns and once infrastructure investments follow those patterns, reversal becomes expensive. Companies don't relocate distribution centers on a whim. Wait, it gets worse. Action 6 through 10 are even more strategic. Infrastructure procurement. Canada's quietly changing the criteria for major government contracts. Instead of explicitly excluding American companies, they're emphasizing localization requirements, technical standards, and supply chain security. Over time, this means American engineering firms, construction companies, and equipment suppliers lose access to billions in contracts. Aerospace and defense procurement follows the same logic. Canada's diversifying suppliers, maintenance contracts, parts sourcing. The message is subtle but clear. Supply security matters more than legacy relationships. And defense contracts anchor entire industrial ecosystems. When those contracts shift, jobs follow. Then there's digital infrastructure. The latest information shows Canada's requiring sensitive government data to stay outside American jurisdiction, favoring non-American cloud providers and cybersecurity firms. This hits technology companies not through tariffs, but through lost long-term contracts. In the global economy, data control defines future competitiveness. Financial pressure comes next. Canadian pension funds and institutional investors are gradually rebalancing portfolios, moving capital away from American assets toward Europe and Asia. Even small shifts signal changing confidence. And in trade war conditions, capital is sensitive to policy volatility. Reduced inflows translate into higher financing costs over time. And finally, legal and diplomatic channels. Canada's activating WTO dispute mechanisms, coordinating with allies. These processes are slow, but they shape narratives. And in the global economy, perception of rule stability affects investment decisions as much as short-term profit. Here's what nobody's explaining. These 10 actions aren't random. They're designed to work together. Each step converts external tariff pressure into internal American cost. Auto workers feel it, farmers feel it, energy companies feel it, technology firms feel it, and once enough constituencies feel pressure simultaneously, political sustainability weakens. So what we're really watching isn't just a trade dispute. We're watching Canada systematically redistribute the cost of tariffs back onto the American economy. And the question now is whether Washington understands what's actually happening. Now let me show you what this really means, because the strategy isn't about retaliation, it's about demonstration. Canada's trying to prove 5 things simultaneously, and each one matters for how this plays out. First, economic sovereignty isn't symbolic. For decades, markets assumed Canada would accept short-term losses to preserve American market access. That assumption gave the United States leverage. What we're learning is that Canada's showing it can absorb pressure without capitulating, and in a trade war, that distinction changes everything. Countries that can't endure tariffs become rule takers. Canada's signaling it intends to remain a rule shaper. But here's where it gets complicated. Second point, Canada has viable alternatives. Trade with the United States remains important, but it's no longer exclusive. The China deal wasn't just about $7 billion in exports. It was about demonstrating optionality. Reports are coming in that European and Asian partners are accelerating investment discussions with Canada. When tariffs destabilize trust, partners start looking for more predictable relationships. And here's what nobody's talking about. In the global economy, optionality is power. When a country has multiple channels for energy, minerals, investment, and data, tariffs lose their coercive effect. Canada doesn't need to abandon the United States. It just needs to reduce dependency enough that threats become less effective. Third message, domestic employment protection. Canada's asserting that jobs inside its borders won't be treated as negotiating chips. Auto manufacturing, EV supply chains, infrastructure, data services. These aren't just growth sectors, they're employment anchors. By prioritizing domestic production and value-added processing, Canada's reframing economic success away from export volumes and toward employment resilience. This is where it gets interesting, because this approach stabilizes communities. When workers see their government prioritizing their jobs over abstract trade relationships, political support strengthens. And in a prolonged trade war, domestic political stability becomes as important as export numbers. Fourth, rules versus transactions. Canada's positioning itself as a defender of structured trade rather than transactional trade. When tariffs get used unpredictably, they increase risk premiums across the global economy. Sources are now confirming that Canada has been quietly building relationships with partners who prioritize stability over short-term advantage. Europe, Japan, South Korea, countries that value predictability. What does that mean practically? It means as tariff volatility increases, Canada becomes more attractive as a partner. In a prolonged trade war, reliability becomes a scarce asset, and countries that demonstrate consistency attract investment even if their market size is smaller. Now, what I'm about to tell you changes the whole picture. The fifth and most consequential message: Canada will no longer function as a free buffer. Historically, Canada absorbed shocks generated by American trade actions because maintaining access was considered paramount. Documents reveal that era is ending. Canada's drawing a line between cooperation and submission. Cooperation remains the goal, but cooperation now comes with conditions: reciprocity, predictability, mutual cost sharing. The latest information shows Canada's prepared to walk away from arrangements that concentrate all the risk on one side. That's not hostility, that's boundary setting. And then this happened, something most analysts missed. In August, Carney made a strategic move. Canada dropped most of its retaliatory tariffs on American goods, kept them only on steel, aluminum, and automobiles. At first, this looked like capitulation. But here's what actually happened. By removing most tariffs while keeping pressure on the sectors that matter most politically in the United States, Canada signaled flexibility without weakness. It was a calculated risk. And what we're learning now is that it worked, because it created space for negotiation while maintaining leverage in the exact areas where American political constituencies feel pressure most intensely: auto workers, steel workers, manufacturing unions, the constituencies that swing elections. But that's not even the real story. The real story is what this strategy generates long term: increased bargaining power. When dependence limits negotiation, diversification expands it. By reducing automatic reliance on American markets, Canada strengthens its ability to negotiate terms rather than accept them. In a trade war, this translates into flexibility. Tariffs lose their ability to dictate outcomes when alternative channels exist. Employment stability, redirecting focus toward domestic production anchors jobs inside Canada. These sectors generate skilled employment with multiplier effects across local economies. Fewer communities exposed to sudden shutdowns caused by external policy decisions. In the global economy, job stability underpins social cohesion and political continuity. Long-term investment attraction. Capital favors environments where policy is predictable. Officials are now saying that trade war volatility increases risk premiums, which discourages long-term projects. By signaling commitment to diversified, rules-based trade relationships, Canada's positioning itself as a lower-risk destination. Over time, this advantage compounds. Investors commit more willingly to infrastructure and advanced manufacturing when exposure is balanced. Wait, it gets worse. Industrial upgrading, moving beyond raw resource exports toward processing, refining, and technology integration captures more value domestically. The latest information shows Canada's emphasizing EV minerals, energy processing, and digital infrastructure. This reflects a shift from volume to value. In a trade war, this reduces vulnerability to price swings and tariffs. Enhanced supply chain security. Concentrated dependence creates bottlenecks. By diversifying routes, partners, and inputs, Canada reduces disruption risk. This matters not only during trade wars, but during broader global shocks. Secure supply chains protect consumers from sudden shortages and businesses from unexpected cost spikes. Here's what makes this approach different. While the trade war with the United States provides the catalyst, the structural gains persist regardless of short-term outcomes. Tariffs may fluctuate, governments may change, but a diversified, value-focused economic structure endures. And that's the part Washington needs to understand, because Canada isn't just responding to tariffs. Canada's using tariffs as justification to restructure dependencies it should have addressed years ago. The pressure from the United States isn't weakening Canada's position. It's accelerating transformation that makes Canada stronger in the long run. So the question becomes this: if every escalation pushes Canada further toward economic independence, what exactly does the United States gain by continuing to apply pressure? All right, let me show you how this actually ends, or more accurately, how it doesn't end, because what we're watching isn't heading toward resolution, it's heading toward permanent restructuring. The immediate American response has been predictable: diplomatic pressure, warnings about destabilizing the relationship, threats of further escalation. But behind closed doors, something different is happening. Corporate America is panicking. Companies embedded in cross-border supply chains are feeling cost increases and uncertainty immediately. Auto manufacturers, agricultural exporters, logistics firms, technology providers, they're not waiting for policy resolution. They're conducting internal reassessments right now. And here's what makes this different from past trade disputes. These companies are pressuring trade associations, unions, and state governments to intervene. In the American political system, this internal feedback loop often matters more than formal diplomatic exchanges. Trade war costs become politically relevant when they threaten jobs and margins simultaneously. That's happening now. Labor organizations are entering the equation: reduced shifts, delayed investment, unstable supply chains. This affects unionized workers directly. Reports are coming in that political representatives in affected states are facing competing demands, defend tariffs rhetorically while mitigating local economic damage. This tension constrains escalation. Even if tariffs remain in place, their political sustainability weakens over time. But here's where it gets complicated. Washington will likely explore selective concessions. Rather than reversing tariffs broadly, officials are now saying the United States might offer carve-outs or temporary exemptions in specific sectors to slow Canada's diversification. These moves would be framed as pragmatic adjustments, not retreats. The objective? Prevent long-term structural realignment while maintaining the appearance of firmness. Now, what I'm about to tell you changes the whole picture. Beyond North America, the global response is markedly different. Europe and Asia are viewing Canada's repositioning as an opportunity. Partners seeking stable access to energy, minerals, and processed goods are moving quickly to deepen ties. Trade negotiations are accelerating. Investment discussions are gaining urgency. In a global economy strained by repeated trade war cycles, predictability attracts attention. Neutral and mid-sized economies are taking note. Canada's actions demonstrate a template: reduce exposure without burning bridges. For countries wary of tariff-driven volatility, Canada becomes a credible alternative hub. The latest information shows this is shifting trade flows incrementally. The impact isn't dramatic in any single quarter, but it becomes decisive over several years. Supply chains are adjusting accordingly. Logistics routes are tilting toward Canadian-controlled corridors. Energy and mineral contracts are locking in non-American destinations. Digital infrastructure decisions are favoring jurisdictions perceived as politically insulated. These changes don't reverse easily. Once capital and infrastructure commit, path dependency sets in. The structure becomes self-reinforcing. Wait, it gets worse. The broader implication for the global economy is subtle but significant. Canada's response signals that tariffs no longer guarantee compliance. Instead, they incentivize redesign. As more countries internalize this lesson, the effectiveness of tariffs as coercive tools diminishes. Trade wars shift from battles of volume to contests of structure. And in contests of structure, flexibility beats force. For the United States, this creates a strategic paradox. Aggressive tariffs may satisfy short-term domestic narratives, but they also accelerate the erosion of influence over integrated partners. Each escalation increases the incentive for others to diversify away. In the long run, this dynamic weakens American centrality in the global economy, not overnight, gradually, then suddenly. But here's what nobody's explaining. Canada's strategy carries risks too. Second-round retaliation from the United States remains possible. Expanded duties, regulatory investigations, sector-specific probes. These measures raise compliance costs and introduce uncertainty. For Canadian exporters still dependent on American demand, this creates short-term stress before diversification benefits fully materialize. Transition costs are real. Redirecting supply chains is expensive. New logistics routes require infrastructure adjustments. New suppliers require qualification and scale. New standards require training and compliance investment. These costs are borne upfront while benefits accrue gradually. If global demand weakens during the transition, Canada could face tighter margins precisely when investment needs are highest. Internal divergence poses another risk. Not all Canadian sectors experience tariffs and trade war exposure equally. Some industries benefit from closer American integration and may resist structural change. Managing this requires coordination and communication. Without consensus, policy execution slows and mixed signals undermine credibility with partners. Market volatility adds complexity. The global economy is already under strain from slowing growth, financial tightening, and geopolitical fragmentation. If a downturn accelerates, diversification becomes more difficult. Partners may delay commitments. Capital may become cautious. In such an environment, the protective benefits of diversification take longer to appear. And here's the critical part. The final risk is endurance. Trade wars rarely resolve quickly. Strategies designed for months often need to function for years. Canada's approach requires patience from businesses, workers, and voters. The payoff is long-term resilience. But the interim period tests confidence. Sustaining support through this phase is as important as the initial decision. Despite these risks, the alternative carries its own cost. Remaining dependent on a single partner that uses tariffs unpredictably concentrates vulnerability. Canada's challenge isn't to eliminate risk, it's to choose which risks to manage. In the context of the global economy, strategic risk management often matters more than short-term comfort. So here's what this comes down to. Canada is sending a clear signal, not just to the United States, to every country watching. Independence isn't a slogan, it's a capability. Supply chains won't be smooth by default anymore. Energy, data, minerals, logistics, technology, they're increasingly entangled with national strategy. In a trade war environment, access can be restricted, repriced, or politicized overnight. Canada's choosing to invest in optionality rather than dependence. And the message is philosophical as much as economic. Canada no longer intends to function as a free buffer inside another country's trade system. Restraint without reciprocity equals exposure. Cooperation remains the preference. But cooperation now comes with conditions. Respect for rules, predictability, mutual cost sharing. These aren't optional anymore. They're prerequisites. The greatest danger for any economy in a prolonged trade war is inertia. Standing still while others redesign their exposure guarantees loss of leverage. Canada's accepting short-term friction in exchange for long-term stability. That trade-off defines mature economic strategy in an unstable global economy. For the United States, the uncomfortable question is this. Tariffs can still disrupt, but can they still control outcomes when partners redesign dependencies instead of absorbing pressure? And for other middle power countries watching this unfold, the question is simpler. If Canada can do this, what's stopping you? I'm curious what you think about this. Does Canada's strategy actually work? Or is this a miscalculation that backfires? Let me know.